What's the state of your website? If you're looking for a new digital experience platform or DXP to run your digital experiences, I have the book for you. The Agile Brand Guide to Digital Experience Platforms is part of my best-selling series of MarTech books. In this book, I explore and demystify DXPs and look at the roles a digital experience platform should play, the different types on the market, as well as how to initially evaluate platforms, then how to best implement a DXP once you've selected it. The book also features a foreword from Rupali Jain, Chief Product Officer at leading DXP provider Optimizely, as well as several other thought leaders in the industry. Learn more and get a copy in print or digital now by going to the Agile Brand Guide website at www.agilebrandguide.com. Hi, this is Greg Kihlstrom. Welcome to the Agile World podcast, where we discuss customer experience, employee experience, and transformation in an agile age. The Agile World podcast is brought to you by TEKsystems, an industry leader in full-stack technology services, talent services, and real-world application. For more information, go to teksystems.com. To read more about the topics discussed on this show, you can go to my website at theagile.world and read my latest articles or get a copy of my latest book, The Center of Experience, a blueprint for creating an experience-led organization, now available on Amazon and other retailers. My name is Greg Kihlstrom, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of CareerGig and host of the Agile World podcast. Today, we're going to talk about creating a sustainable workforce that can help your brand be successful, no matter what the business environment may throw your way. We're obviously living in tumultuous times and cannot control all aspects of our business, but the right strategic approach to building a culture and talent pool can make a huge difference in how you weather any storm. To help me discuss this topic, I'd like to welcome Roberta Matuson, a best-selling author, Forbes contributor, and marketing leader who has worked with General Motors, New Balance, the Boston Beer Company, and more. Roberta, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Greg, for having me.
Absolutely. Well, as a fellow author, I wanted to first commend you on having 5 books with a 6th on the way. That's certainly no easy feat. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your latest book, Evergreen Talent, and how you think it's relevant to the current work environment?
Well, Evergreen Talent is all about how to seed, grow, and cultivate a sustainable workforce. The book released in February, just in time for the pandemic. And my first reaction to that after, I was worried about my family's safety was, oh my gosh, we're releasing in the middle of the pandemic. But I'm happy to say that it seems like, we're into this now. When you and I are talking, it's 5 months. And it feels like companies are once again paying attention to their talent, which is actually a really good thing. I was talking last week to a friend who's a CIO, and she said to me, you would not believe how many calls and emails I have gotten in the last few weeks asking me to consider new job opportunities. And she's, happily employed. And she just got to the point where she said, I just can't stop not responding because the money is incredible. So if your listeners are out there thinking, oh, there's so many job losses right now and no one is hiring, and how does this relate to me? I'm telling you, hiring is going on, and it's going on 24/7. And so you need to make sure that, you're keeping the people that you have on board happy and challenged, and that if you are looking for talent, that you keep your foot on the accelerator.
Well, that's great to hear, and great to know that there are some opportunities still out there, even despite the challenging times. What advice do you have to build a sustainable workforce during such challenging times? So and what I mean by that is just with all the fluctuations, it's how do you keep things flexible enough, and yet to your point, when you need talent, you need to be able to focus on that.
Well, I think it's interesting. I've been through, financial challenging times before. And so I've personally been on the other side of the fence when, everything just literally tanked. I was living in Houston and the oil industry just went bottomed out, and overnight jobs were lost. And I was one of those people. And at the time, I couldn't understand, like, why was I being laid off? Why was my employer letting me go? And they were keeping the more expensive, more seasoned talent. And it wasn't until my colleague said to me, I can do your job and my job. And that's why they're keeping me. You can't do my job. You don't have enough experience. And so as your listeners are going through this, process and reevaluating their talent, and many of them, I'm sure, are making tough decisions regarding whether or not they're going to need to reduce their workforce. Even though it happened to me, my advice is, hang on to your experienced talent. They may cost a little bit more, but you don't have to train them. They can probably do their job and the job below them. They have the skills, and we will come out of this, and you will want your strongest players on board.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. Is there anything you can share about? You've got a 6 book coming up. Is there anything you can share about that to pique our listeners' interest?
Yeah, it's called The Conversation Equation, and it's about challenging conversations at work. And the book will be a guide to not only, for leaders on how to handle those challenging conversations, but it will also be for those on the other side of that equation, the person, whose boss says we need to talk, how you can handle those conversations and turn them around to your advantage.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I can imagine. Despite whatever might be going on in the world, there's always people that deserve title changes or salary increases or responsibility changes or things like that. So yeah, that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And before we started, you and I were chatting, and I mentioned that I just interviewed Christina Cook, who's the astronaut that holds the record for the longest time in space for a woman. And she and I were talking about leadership. And, I asked her the question, you're up in space, right? And so you get there, and you're the new girl on the block, literally, and yet you're now in charge. And so, what are some of the more challenging conversations that you had? And it was just pretty interesting how many of the conversations we have here on planet Earth are the same conversations that they're having out at the space station and the
Yeah,
same
yeah.
challenges.
Wow. Yeah. No, that sounds like a fascinating conversation.
Oh, yeah, it was.
Awesome. Switch gears a little bit here. As a strategic advisor on talent to some of the world's top brands, you have a lot of access to best practices out there. What advice as you said, we're 5 months into the pandemic here. What advice would you have for an organization to help them navigate the months ahead? What's the best way for them to manage in an unpredictable environment? Should things continue to get better, can get worse and then better? How do they navigate this uncertainty?
Well, I think you have to have a plan A, B, and C, right? The plan A is things get better. The plan B, things get worse. And plan C, things stay the same. I like to be optimistic and look at the plan A, because if it is plan A, that means that you have a tremendous opportunity to move forward while your competitors are all looking at their plan C, right?
Yeah.
Because they're not as optimistic as you are. And in our situation that we're in, that means really taking the time now while you have it, to look at things like your employment brand, to look at how others are viewing you in the marketplace, looking at your hiring processes, and asking yourself, does this make sense anymore? And how can we be more efficient? And how can we hire people that we may never meet? I do that with my clients in a 1 day, strategy session, and the results are amazing. And a lot of people think like it would take you months to develop this strategy, but when you're laser focused, you can get a lot done. And so I would tell your listeners to really, focus on moving 1 or 2 things forward a mile, rather than those 10 things forward an inch.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I've heard this from a few different people in a few different ways as far as it's not even necessarily that there's downtime, but I talked to somebody from a museum where they took a completely different approach to virtual exhibits. I talked to a chef who had time to actually think through like a completely different way of, different dishes to cook and all those types of things. So, and what you're saying falls in line with that is there is definitely, uh, there's definitely a crisis, and there is crisis messaging and communication and all that, but there's also potential opportunity to work on things that have maybe slipped aside and stuff. How would you? I know you touched on this just now, but how would you recommend that someone finds the time to do that? Is it a matter of delegating certain things to certain people, or like how would they start? I guess.
Well, I think you have to start first by asking yourself, is this really a priority? I'll use myself as an example. I've been talking about redoing my website for probably 3 years,
Yeah, yeah,
and just before the pandemic, I made the decision, you know what, this is the time and I'm going to do it. And in the midst of the pandemic, it was just even more clear to me that I needed to make sure that I was more clear in my messaging and I had more time to devote to that. And so I said to myself, this is a priority. I had a very similar conversation with a client of mine, and we have talked many, many times about his employer brand. And it does not represent at all the quality organization that he runs. And, in spite of my, best wishes for him, I just finally had to say to him, I gave him a proposal. He wasn't doing anything with it. And I just said, listen, you're not ready. You're not going to make
yeah.
this commitment. So, if it's important to you, you will make it a priority. You will make the commitment. If you're finding that you're just like, you keep putting something at the bottom of the list, then it's really not important. So just take it off the list.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's great.
And if you
Well,
take it off the list, Greg, just be prepared to keep paying, 30% to, your local recruiter, your recruitment firm that you're
right,
working with, right? So you
right.
can't complain like you're paying all this money in recruitment fees. Yet, had you just stopped and invested half of that money, even a third, in getting this done and getting it done right, you'd be able to attract talent towards you.
Yeah, yeah. Totally agree. Well, one other topic here. A lot of what I'm focused on right now with my current venture career gig relates to the 1099 workforce and freelancers. What do you see organizations doing in relation to hiring these 1099s and freelancers? And do you see that changing in the months ahead?
Well, I think if anything, it's going to increase, right? Because a lot of people have panicked and they have let people go because they have to show their shareholders that they're, getting the organization in shape and that they're going to ride this out. So they're throwing the baggage off the boat as they go.
Yeah.
But at some point, all of a sudden a call comes in from a client that says, "Hey, we want you to do this." And the person who does this is no longer there. I think we're going to see a dramatic increase in the number of gig workers.
Do you think that, I mean, I lived through the 2008, 2009 crisis, and where I saw really the creation of the gig economy. And there were always freelancers and 1099 contractors, obviously. But we saw the creation of Uber and Lyft and Instacart and all those things, as well as just a bigger freelance workforce. Do you see this accelerated? Do you see the COVID pandemic accelerating this, or is this kind of the new normal of a more hybrid workforce, or where do you see this kind of shaking out, I guess, in 12 months or so?
Well, I think it depends on what your what business you're in. So, for example, if you're an Uber or Lyft, you're in trouble, right?
Yeah.
Because people aren't using their apps. I can't remember the last time I called for an Uber or a Lyft, and I used to do that, weekly.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I walked into Wegmans one morning and all of a sudden, I think it was 9 o'clock and the place got super, super crowded. And I was like, what the heck? And the store manager looked at me and I looked at him, and And he said, "Oh, those are the Instacart shoppers. We left them in at 9 o'clock." And there were like 10 times as many of them as there were customers like me shopping. And I was
Yeah.
like, holy moly. So I think, we're going to still see growth in those areas. So it really depends on, what market you're filling.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Well, let's talk about company culture a little bit, and especially as it relates to attracting and retaining talent. How do you recommend that organizations hire in order to have the type of culture they want?
Well, I think they have to backtrack and decide first and foremost what kind of culture they want and not vice versa. So once you get really clear on what kind of organization you want to be, then you look at the traits of the people that would fit into that culture. And then you can hire based on those traits. So what I find happens in many organizations, they don't do that and they just start hiring. And then they get like these mismatched people. Then they're trying to create this culture. And some people, are there because they love the startup culture, but they're not really interested in the long term. Yet they're there and they start to whine, and it just creates a lot of havoc. So I think it's really important, in the beginning to put your stake in the ground and say, this is who we are, and then go from there.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. What about when you need to make a shift in culture? So, let's say leadership identifies that, that you use the startup example of, there's certain qualities that a startup needs that, uh, like being really creative and innovative and team focused and on all that stuff. And a more seasoned organization may need a little more process and sales driven and stuff like that. How does an organization identify when a shift needs to happen? And then maybe talk a little bit about how you might get started in making a shift.
Well, I think you'll know when a shift needs to happen when you sense like you're moving from one phase. It's sort of like, with kids, right? You see a shift happening when they start to walk, right? And they become a toddler. And then you see another shift when they start school. And then when they hit puberty, like you see these shifts, you feel these shifts.
Yeah.
And so it's the same in the organization. They go through different phases. And you go through your startup phase and you've got your, seed money, and then the venture people come in, and then maybe the CEO steps out and they bring in a seasoned CEO, and then that changes. And so the organization is in a constant state of change, and you have to adapt and adjust for that.
Yeah. Have you found a good way to measure for that, or like what is your when you come into an organization, how do you get a handle on where the culture is?
All I have to do, and these are back in the days when you could do that, is
Yeah.
walk in and look around. And, I had an experience where I walked into a prospect to meet with the CEO. And it was a company that was filled with a lot of young people. And I was absolutely taken back by the silence. And these people were, in, cubicles. And I went into the lunch area to get just a glass of water. And people were in there, but no one was talking. There was no laughter. And I just looked around and I was like, I thought I was on another planet. This is not typical of a young company with lots of energy. And when I sat down with that CEO, it took me 2 seconds to figure out why that was the case. And I'll tell
Wow.
you, I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I was like, I am not going to be able to help these people. This is
Yeah.
not going to happen. And I wanted to take half the staff with me. Like, I can save you. Come.
Nice.
So you
Yeah, no,
can tell a lot just by walking in and listening and observing.
that's great. Yeah, no, and I'm sure you've seen quite a range of different types of atmospheres and everything like that in your career.
Absolutely.
So, one last question before we wrap up. As the author of five and soon to be six books and active contributor to Forbes and other publications, can you talk a little bit about your writing process and how do you find the time to research and write thoughtful pieces while also doing your consulting work? And do they help one another as far as, one inspiring the other and all that?
Well, I think it's an interesting question because I say this all the time to people, like, you cannot make this stuff up. And so I write about what I see and observe and what people share with me. And there are so many stories out there. So I don't do a lot of research because my writing is anecdotal. I leave that research up to the professors at, Harvard and Yale and Penn and those people. But I write the way I speak, and people seem to enjoy that because I tell them like it is. And I don't worry about filtering anything because, I don't have a boss. I don't really care if I've offended, someone because I'm not going to get fired.
Right.
So it's very freeing. And when you write that way, it allows you to write very quickly.
That's great. That's great. Love to hear that. Well, Roberta, thanks so much for joining the show. And for those listening, what's the best way for them to keep up with what you're doing?
They can go to my website, which is Matuson, Matuson, consulting.com. They can follow me on Twitter at Matuson, or they can send me a request to connect on LinkedIn. And Greg, if they mention that they heard me talk on your show, that will guarantee that I will accept their request rather than just throwing out a request and I'm like, who is this person? So it would be my pleasure to connect.
Wonderful. No, I appreciate that. Thank you. No, that's great. Great to hear. Well, again, I'd like to thank Roberta Matuson, president of Matuson Consulting, for joining the show. To learn more about customer and employee experience, I recommend you go to my website at gregkillstrom.com and make sure to check out my latest book, The Center of Experience. More information is available on my website or wherever the book is available, like Amazon. Thanks for listening to The Agile World with Greg Killstrom. See you next week. Thanks again for listening to the Agile World podcast, brought to you by TEKsystems. I'm your host, Greg Killstrom. You can learn more and get a copy of my latest book, The Center of Experience, from my website at theagile.world or on Amazon or other retailers. Until next week, stay agile.